Vince Cipolla, President and CEO of Historic New England. I'm delighted to welcome you to our night of prizes. Thank you all for joining us. Tonight we honor the 2021 winners of the Historic New England Book Prize and the Prize for Collecting Works on Paper. It is the 27th anniversary of the Book Prize, which since 1995 has recognized more than 80 authors who have created works of enduring value that have expanded our understanding of New England. It is the 20th anniversary of the Collecting Prize, which since 2010 has honored 23 individuals for their commitment to assembling and sharing paper-based collections that inform and enlighten us about the world around us. Because this is a virtual event, people from all over the country are able to join in the celebration. And now on to the prize for collecting works on paper. This prize honors collectors or dealers who have assembled or helped save significant collections of historical material related to New England or the nation as a whole that might otherwise have been left unrecognized or lost. The collections range from books, manuscripts, photographs, and prints and drawings to all kinds of ephemera. As I mentioned earlier, during the past 12 years, Historic New England has honored women and men whose passion, dedication, and commitment to preserving and making accessible a record of human thought and activity have resulted in the creation of extraordinary collections. These collections have ranged from material related to World War II, to the White Mountains and the Cape Cod Canal, from the temperance movement to the industries of the Shakers, from the history of pets in America to the history of tattooing in America, among others. The committee responsible for selecting the winners of the prize for collecting works on paper is made up of Historic New England Collections Committee and Council members, connoisseurs, and staff. Committee members Richard Cheek, who serves as chair and who first conceived of and advocated for this prize more than 12 years ago, Ann Rogers Haley, Susan Payne, Earl G. Shuttleworth Jr., Angie Simons, Charles Wood, Lorna Condon, and I enthusiastically selected this year's award winner. I want to thank the committee for their service. As the other members of the committee and I review the numerous nominations for this past year's award, we were struck by the tremendous commitment and enthusiasm of the nominees and the extraordinary breadth of the collections they had assembled. After careful consideration, the committee selected two winners of this year's prize for collecting works on paper. I am delighted to present the 2021 prize for collecting works on paper to Barbara Fahs Charles of Washington, D.C., and James Kochan of Wiscasset, Maine. Barbara Charles is a nationally known museum consultant who began documenting American carousels in 1971. Since then, Barbara has amassed the most extensive collection of carousel-related ephemera and photographs in the country, including makers' catalogs, photographs, stereo cards, postcards, tickets, prints, and cartoons. Of course, New England resorts and parks where carousels operated are represented in the collection through brochures, posters, timetables, photographs, among other items. Barbara, a board member of the Ephemera Society of America, is a co-founder of the National Carousel Association and is active in the preservation of operating carousels. She has published widely on the subject. It is now my pleasure to introduce Barbara, who will tell us about her extraordinary collection. Barbara, and congratulations, Barbara.
Thank you, Vin. This is really quite an honor. I'm absolutely delighted. Here. All collections have an origin story, and mine began on the Santa Monica Pier. In 1968, I rented a cheap apartment above the carousel. I had no interest in carousels. This is the view from my apartment, my first carousel. I had never ridden one as a child, as far as I know. I lived above the carousel for 3 years and found that it was a way to teach myself photography. So on weekends, I would go out and photograph carousels. They had light, action, kids, all kinds of things, but they would be there the next week when I didn't take good photographs. In 1971, I left California and drove around the country for 5 months doing the first photographic survey of American carousels. I reached New England late in the summer, and one day was absolutely fabulous, particular day, when I saw Watch Hill, Rhode Island in the morning, this wonderful little, very, very early carousel, one of America's earliest ones, and the kids just so joyously catching rings. And in the afternoon, I closed out with the Louf's magnificent carousel at Crescent Park. Both, I'm delighted to say, 50 years later, are still operating. At the end of the trip, I decided to stay in Washington. I was offered a small part-time job, and I thought I could research at the Smithsonian and the Library of Congress, only to discover that neither of these great institutions had any original material. So a collection started. Postcards are the easiest to find, but finding good ones where you can see the whole carousel is not necessarily so easy. And there are very few, for many of these carousels, the postcard may be the only illustration that still exists. Then a couple of years later, my husband noted in the Antique Trader that some posters for C.W. Parker were for sale. I contacted the men that had them for sale, and after about 2 weeks of calling them almost every night, they allowed me to come to Florida and see what all they had. They had acquired much of the archives of the C.W. Parker Company from his son, Paul Parker. We negotiated, and in the end, I took home everything I could in my empty suitcases. And about 3 weeks later, they showed up in a truck with an open bed in the back, filled with boxes and papers. While there's piles and boxes of material, the key parts are the ledgers that talk about the carousels that Parker made and all the photographs. In this example, if you look at the second entry, this is for J.A. Ellis in Venice, California. And he buys this huge carousel, a 4-breast, one of the biggest that Parker ever made, in 1921. But the company repossesses it in 1924. And then in 1927, in the pencil, it shows that they installed it at Jansen Beach, a new park in Portland, Oregon. And in 1935, it was fully paid for. I have shared probably 20 or more photographs about this carousel to Restore Oregon, who are now restoring it for future use. The collection also includes when it was first installed at Jansen Beach, and I love these pictures of everybody washing the horses. The collection also had, beyond all the Parker material, and I probably now have the largest collection of any Parker material, catalogs for a number of other makers. Catalogs are quite rare, and Parker was very interested in seeing what the competition was doing and was not above copying. I do collect European material, 18th and 19th century. I would love 17th century. And the earliest American piece I have is a broadside from the 1830s or 1840s. I believe that this is the earliest image of any carousel. And what's phenomenal in this broadside, and it's a very large broadside, Daniel Herzog owned it, and he was born without legs. And it's in German and English, and he says, you know, that he's born without legs, and he's using this carousel to support himself. When he died in 1850, the carousel sold for $25, and his drums and ankles, which were the music, for $5. Only his horse sold for more. Another large broadside in the collection is this one for the Hibernian's Picnic at Gardner, Massachusetts, from 1877. I also have from 1878 a stereo card of the little flying horses that operated at Gardner. These flying horses, just like Herzog had, were very typical and probably the only rides in many places for many, many years. I also collect photographs when I can get them, such as this tintype of a little platform machine, possibly 1860s. And on the left is the Dare Carousel at Oaks Bluff, Martha's Vineyard, from the 1870s, a more sophisticated version of the carousel seen in the tintype. I love large posters when I can get them. They're quite rare. And this one's from about 1889 or 90. And you can see that the trolleys are coming along and they're dropping people off. And the first ride, and then probably the only ride in this park they will see, is this little carousel. Easier to find, but I still have to get them one by one, and they're fairly rare, are booklets, timetables, tickets about these parks. And I do collect this material so that you can understand how these carousels operated, where they operated. And I love photographs even when they're badly water stained. This one from Nahant Beach, Massachusetts, is quite delightful. On the side, it says "To the Carousel," and it seems to have almost a Remington painting of cowboys galloping along, and underneath it, it says "Steam Galloping Horses." And on the right, you can see the little carousel, which was undoubtedly steam operated. In the late 1880s and 90s and into the early 1900s, the most popular carousels in America were these steam riding galleries. 5 or 6 companies made them. The most important company was Armitage Herschel of North Tonawanda, New York. Some of them operated, like the one in Nahant, at a permanent location, but probably most of them were operated by small-time operators. The one ride they owned was the steam riding gallery, and they would go from place to place, and they hand out a flyer or a card or make an ad in a newspaper showing where they were going to operate. And as in many cases, increasingly in the 90s, they had to get a license to set up their carousel. Only about 7 or 8 of these little rides still exist. The finest one is being set up now in Orrington, Maine. It was bought by Ivory H. Fenderson in 1896 from the Armitage Herschel Company. He operated it around Maine, New Hampshire, and northern Massachusetts till 1922, when he put it in a barn. In the 1970s, his son donated it to a small historic village in Newfield, Maine. That village got it operating in the 90s and operated it there until about 2018. But the village went bankrupt, and the carousel now has been moved to 19th century Curon Village in Orrington, Maine. And they report that they will have it up and operating for their ice harvesting ceremony festival this winter. And I'm absolutely delighted. It's absolutely complete, and it's the finest example of these little rides. And I plan to donate my award to this carousel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Barbara. That was absolutely wonderful. And I mentioned to Barbara that I operated a carousel in high school to the peril of the riders. And but so many of us have very sweet memories of the carousels of our youth. Next up, as an expert and leading dealer in early American military and naval manuscripts, rare books, and works of art, James Kochan has been of great service to museums and research institutions, serving as their agent in strategic collections building. In addition to his important work building public collections, James has assembled one of the finest public study collections of rare books, prints, maps, artwork, and manuscripts focused on the early military and naval history and material culture of Maine until statehood in 1820. He has also published 7 books and more than 100 articles or research reports dealing with early American and New England military and naval material culture and history. It is my great pleasure to introduce James, who will tell us more about his collection. James.
As Barbara said earlier, every collection begins with a story. I discovered Kenneth Roberts as a youngster and began reading Kenneth Roberts' historical fiction. And Kenneth Roberts, of course, always included Maine in his stories of early American history. And no one brought history to life to me so much as Kenneth Roberts. That and Family Vacations, which always included forts and battlefields from the colonial through War of 1812 period. I grew up in northern Ohio, and of course the exploits of Oliver Hazard Perry on the Battle of Lake Erie, William Henry Harrison at the Battle of the Thames and the Siege of Fort Meigs were imbued in me at an early age, and my interest in the War of 1812 increased as I became an adult. I didn't begin collecting works on paper until I left the museum profession in 1998 and became a dealer. As a dealer, my strategy was buy things that interested me. I can't fake enthusiasm. Buy things that I found fascinating, that provided great amounts of new data historically. And I was very focused on items that revealed things about the material culture of our founding fathers and mothers, as opposed to pursuing autographs of famous peoples. I like the nuts and bolts of everyday life, what they wore, how they ate, how they lived, what they thought of things. The everyday man was a major focus in my collecting approach. This is a logbook, one of my most exciting acquisitions in the early 2000s. It was written by a young midshipman, Horatio Nelson Head. His godfather was Horatio Nelson. He went to the Royal Naval Academy, where he learned drawing in watercolor under John Shetke, a very important marine artist who was also the instructor of drawing, which was a very critical element if you were pursuing a naval career. Officers were expected to draw topographical views, waterside views of terrain as they encountered it, do mapping. So Head was an exceptional artist. And this is his logbook from the voyage of HMS Lacedaemonian during the War of 1812, a 2-year group of logbooks that cover the campaigns in America from 1813 to the close of the war, interspersed with original watercolors he did on the spot. Another exciting find was the diary, the unpublished diary of George Watson, who was the chaplain general of the British Expeditionary Force that invaded the Chesapeake Bay in 1814. And this is a little close-up shot of one of his entries about the capture of Washington, D.C., and coming to the president's house, the White House, and finding a handsome building in the center of the city with a table spread for a dinner, perhaps the victory banquet they thought that would happen after the Battle of Bladensburg, which of course the Americans lost. Then he goes on to proceed about the burning of the city. Well, when the British tried to take Baltimore, between the defense of Fort McHenry and the Battle of North Point, also known during the period as the Battle of Patapsco Neck, we had a wonderful American victory, or at least pushed the English out of Baltimore. This view was done within weeks of the Battle of Patapsco Neck. It was being advertised by its engraver, Andrew Dulac, who was a Baltimorean engraver who was also a participant at the battle. He was a corporal in the 1st Jaeger Rifle Company of Baltimore. And he's also the first engraver of what became the Star Spangled Banner, originally published in 1814 as the defense of Fort McHenry. Another exciting find is a watercolor view of a fort that looked over the East River, built during the same time period to defend New York City from potential British invasion. This is Fort Stevens on Long Island, looking towards Mill Rock and Hellgate. It was done by John Joseph Holland, who made his living mostly as a painter of theatrical backdrops in New York City, but he was employed by the topographical engineers when they were doing all the work around New York City fortifying in 1814. The cannon here is a distinctly American model of siege or garrison artillery known as the Burbeck carriage. It's named for its designer, Colonel Henry Burbeck, who was the commander of the American artillery before the War of 1812. Henry Burbeck's papers came on the market. They were broken up by the family in the late 19th to the early 20th century. Some family members donated portions to various institutions such as Francis Tavern Museum and New London Historical Society, but a large portion of them remained in family hands and were eventually sold off in groupings. A very large, important grouping became available, and it was able to acquire that entire collection and keep it intact without being broken up, and it's now part of the William Clements Library at Ann Arbor, Michigan. This is a watercolor plan of Fort Scammell in Portland, Maine. And it's an earthwork fort with masonry reinforcements. And the cannon that you see on the ramparts drawn by the designer are these Burbeck gun carriages that we saw in the Holland art drawing earlier. I moved to Maine in 2016. And one of the reasons I moved to Mid-Coast Maine is I became enamored of Fort Edgecombe across the river from Wiscasset. Fort Edgecombe was built in 1808, 1809. It's what they call a second period coastal fort. It really isn't a fort at all. It's actually a series of batteries protected in its rear by a blockhouse. This blockhouse, this is from a circa 1900 postcard, still stands today. It's a really fine example of a second period coastal fortification. The blockhouse is, with its original earthwork, it's quite intact as you see here. It's a little eroded today. And below it were two series of semicircular water batteries, one above the other. The lowest battery having the heaviest artillery, the upper battery having a lighter battery of artillery. And it was designed to defend Wiscasset. It was known at the time as the Wiscasset Garrison. And it only had a company of infantry, but they were all trained as artillerists from the 4th Infantry. And that regiment was raised essentially from sailors who were unemployed due to the embargo that was taking place at the same time the fort was being built. I was delighted to discover this fine return for the artillery and ordnance supplies at Wiscasset and Georgetown on the eve of the War of 1812. I've never encountered another return for the garrison. So this really filled in a lot of blanks as to what type of ordnance they had, how many, and when. In the returns and some correspondence I found in the National Archive, we found that many of the carriages in the water batteries at Wiscasset were on what they call garrison carriages, or they were very similar to the sea carriages aboard naval warships. And this is an original watercolor view of an 18-pounder, which the garrison, half of the garrison's heavy artillery were 18-pounders on these carriages. John Binney commanded the garrison from 1809 until 1813. He was the company commander of that 4th Infantry Company there. And this is, the return was made by him. And here are some of his remarks. And at the time in 1810, the 12-pounders and the 6-pounders are still not mounted on carriages. All others are mounted. The 6-pounders were largely placed in the blockhouse above the two water batteries to defend the open rears of the water batteries. Just earlier this year, I acquired an orderly book of a Maine District Militia Regiment, the 4th Regiment of the 1st Brigade of the 8th Division of Maine Militia, or I should say Massachusetts Militia, but from the Maine District. And I'm I'm very interested in early military dress, and this regimental order from February of 1812 tells the officers of this regiment the uniform that they're all required to wear, which is a blue coat with red facings and silver trim, as in this watercolor portrait miniature. Famous naval views, of course, are the War of 1812. One of the most burgeoning things in the popular arts were the popular prints of naval victories. There weren't too many land victories for quite some time. So we were celebrating our frigate actions, and this is one that didn't go well for the Americans towards the end of the war. It's when the British squadron, including HMS Endymion, takes the USS President, commanded by Stephen Decatur. I show this because the Endymion, I should say, was part of the flotilla that a few months earlier had captured the upper part of the Maine district, beginning with Eastport and Castine in September of 1814. September 1st, actually, Castine fell. Within 12 days, the garrison at Wiscasset and at Bath were alerted and were trying to mobilize troops. And this is a letter from one of the officers that was sent by the governor of Massachusetts to assist Major General William King of Bath, who commanded the troops in that area, the militia troops, in organizing a defense of the area. There were very few regular troops left in the Maine district. Maine was pretty much, the Maine district had been left both by the state of Massachusetts and by the federal government to fend for itself. But they did so very well when they mobilized over 1,500 militiamen to reinforce the very small federal garrison at Fort Edgecombe and built new works all around Wiscasset. And finally, as the war began to wane in Maine, at least the land war, we find a return to peace and blacksmithing tools to carry on working on the garrison at Wiscasset. Little nice return of blacksmithing tools. Back to Kenneth Roberts here. This is from the front, the inside end papers of Captain or Lively Lady. And a big part of this novel deals with the life of New England mariners, privateersmen during the War of 1812, and beginning with impressment, and then setting out as privateers, and then we find captures, incentive. This return, this document on the right, is the announcement of a prize court to be held in Wiscasset to determine the fate of a captured British vessel that was captured by an American privateer by the name of the Thomas. And this prize court was to take place on the 2nd of September, 1813. The privateers of New England took many, many British ships, thousands. And this is an English aquatint view of a capture that didn't happen. It was a famous American privateer, the Grand Turk, which was built in Wiscasset. And she, in this action, is attempting to take a mail packet, the Hinchinbrook, a British mail packet, but the Hinchinbrook successfully fights her off. And of course, that's why this aquatint is published in London shortly after the event. But the Grand Turk had a tremendous record during the War of 1812 of capturing prizes. And this is a wonderful watercolor view of her sailing into Marseille after the close of naval activities against Great Britain with the coming of peace and the Treaty of Ghent. Now, not all privateers were so lucky. Thousands ended up in the prison hulks and in the infamous Dartmoor prison on the moors. And many of these prisoners that were not released. Coming of peace, the Treaty of Ghent had not been fully affirmed yet, and so they're all remaining in captivity at Dartmoor. And finally, there was an event, an altercation between prisoners and the militia guards, and the ensuing massacre of many American sailors. And that's chronicled in a number of early American prints, some actually done from drawings by eyewitnesses who were there at the event. And this wonderful memorial concerning the massacre at Dartmoor was done by a Massachusetts sailor from Salem, but it shows the typical garb of a New England sailor, just as a sailor from the Maine district would wear. Well, eventually they were released and returned home to much rejoicing, a wonderful watercolor view of sailors and their companions in a tavern celebrating the coming of peace. And finally, we close with a watercolor view of British vessels and their prizes sailing from America to Bermuda. Thank you.
That was wonderful, James. Thank you. Thank you so much. We now turn to the 2021 Historic New England Book Prize. The book prize was created with two goals in mind. First, to recognize significant publications that advance the understanding of New England's architecture, landscape, and material culture, which includes works in the decorative arts, archaeology, historic preservation, the history of photography, and other related subjects. And second, to underscore Historic New England's commitment to the scholarship of the region. For this year's prize, the Book Prize Committee carefully evaluated 31 titles, considering new scholarship, fresh perspectives, and accessibility to a broad and diverse audience. After thoughtful deliberation, the committee selected the prize winner and two honor books. I want to thank the committee members, Lynn Bassett, Pam Fox, Paula Laverty, Susan Maycock, Tom Mickey, Tim Rohan, Chloe Tepper, Lorna Condon, and Diane Vieira for their hard work this year. Once again, it was a remote process that involved mailing books back and forth to each other and participation in many Zoom meetings. And now to the first honor book award. The Book Prize Committee named Maine and American Art, the Farnsworth Art Museum, as a 2021 honor book. Produced by the Farnsworth Art Museum, the volume was written by Michael Komanecky, the museum's chief curator, Jane Bianco, the museum's curator, and Angela Waldron, the museum's registrar. Published on the occasion of Maine's bicentennial, this lavishly illustrated book illuminates Maine's central role in American art from the early 19th century to the present. A Book Prize Committee member wrote this about the publication. The book covers an enormous variety of art, and the contributing authors are in full command of their material. The volume successfully conveys what is distinctive about the Farnsworth Museum's collection, its enormous variety, its founding and growth over time. In doing so, it goes well beyond most museum handbooks while still remaining accessible to the general reader. It is now my pleasure to recognize Maine and American Art, the Farnsworth Art Museum, as a 2021 honor book, and to introduce Michael Komanecky, who will talk about this superb publication. Michael.
Thank you, Vin. It's an honor to receive the award, and I have to commend my two colleagues on this project, Jane Bianco and Angela Waldron. It was certainly something we shared as a labor of love to tell the story about the Farnsworth Art Museum. And with that, I will begin. As you noted, this is a somewhat unusual publication. We looked at literally dozens of museum handbooks, and we were about to embark on the first one in 20 years. And we felt, compared to what had been done, we had a different story to tell, and it was one that we enjoyed very much. And with that, I will begin. We decided that our collection reflected a number of things. Certainly the story of our founding by Lucy Copeland Farnsworth, the last surviving member of a prominent but not particularly wealthy Rockland, Maine family. There were clusters of works by individual artists that needed to be focused upon, we thought, but there was a larger story of what the art depicted about the state of Maine. And as you see from this table of contents, it covers geography, geology, and the economy of Maine, as well as the works of art created by the many artists who came to Maine from the beginning of the 19th century till today, and the kinds of things that they were interested in. And the story began really in March of 1918, when the almost 80-year-old Lucy Copeland Farnsworth, the last surviving member of her family, wrote to a law firm in Portland, Maine, to say something very succinctly and clearly. She had written her will and wanted the Portland law firm to draw it up. There's no doubt in my mind that she chose a firm in Portland because of the prominence of its law firms, but probably also to keep her plans a secret from the city of Rockland, where she spent almost all of her 95 years. This is the home in which she grew up, built around 1850, a wonderful example of Greek Revival architecture, of which there's a great deal in Maine, to be sure. What was thought originally about Lucy when her gift was announced, when her will was read in 1936, was a strange thing that she decided to create an art museum, especially in such a place on the coast of Maine. But it became very clear once one took a good look at what she grew up with. The Farnsworth family, as well as the Sprague family of her mother's side of the family, had been in New England for, by that time, a century and a half. But when her father decided to build a new home for the growing family, they abandoned all the belongings that they surely had from their rich family history and opted for the most impressive and up-to-date Victorian style of the 1850s. And this room, the formal parlor, is a remarkably preserved example of a home from this period, with original furnishings and lighting dating from the 1850s through the 1870s. And as you can see by the things on the walls, she indeed grew up with art. Not great art, but there was a rich visual culture around her from the time she was a little girl. One of the earliest artists to depict Maine in the 1820s was Jonathan Fisher, a Harvard graduate of its divinity school, who came to Blue Hill to begin leading his flock. And he was not only a minister, he was a remarkably gifted man, a kind of enlightenment figure. He not only painted, as you see here, but he was designed and built his home. He designed and built furniture. He was a scientist, he was a botanist, he was a mathematician, he was a surveyor. He was a remarkably and profoundly inventive and productive individual. Another artist whose works really represent the early history of art in Maine is Fitzhenry Lane, who came to the coast of Maine in the 1850s and worked up and down from the mid-coast a bit to the down east. And this painting of the Camden Mountains depicts another aspect of Maine that was important. There is a sailing vessel in the right center of the screen, which was used to haul lumber. And of course, the lumber industry was a huge part of Maine's economy. Maine's woods and waters are depicted as well in so many ways. I have to say that it was sometimes a difficult choice to decide what images to put in what parts of the book, because they spoke to so many things. Here, the seafaring character of Maine and the logging industry, to which I just referred from the Fitzhenry Lane painting. Work, of course, is a part of Maine's history that's depicted in many of the paintings and photographs in our collection. George Tice's painted lobster buoys in Stonington, still today captures an essential character of the fishing industry in Maine, including in Stonington. Carol Thayer Barry's painting of the Bath Iron Works in 1941 is a very different aspect. The Bath Iron Works was founded in the middle of the 19th century. And has, of course, remained as one of the great shipbuilding ports in the United States, particularly for military vessels. This impressionist style painting captures something that was vitally important during World War II. People, of course, figure into the story here in two remarkable works. Leopold Cypher, not a well-known artist, but he did this wonderful drawing of Leopold Stokowski, who was brought to the Bar Harbor area by many of its wealthy summer residents who wanted to enjoy the music brought by him and fellow musicians who were there during the second decade of the 20th century. Bernice Abbott, one of the great American photographers, did a remarkable body of work in Maine, including this portrait of the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Edna St. Vincent Millay. Particularly in the late 19th century, artists of all stripes, especially from New York, but also from Philadelphia and Boston, came to summer in Maine, a phenomenon that's still very much a part of Maine's life these days. Winslow Homer painted here extensively, as many of you know, had a home and studio in Prout's Neck. But Edward Hopper also came here, although most of his work was done in Portland. He did about 5 or 6 works in a very short stay in Rockland during 1926. And the house he depicts is still present in Rockland. It was then a boarding house for mariners when he saw it. Another key moment in the development of the history of art in Maine came in the 19-teens when Robert Henry, a highly esteemed and beloved teacher who worked in New York in the Art Students League, came to Maine. He arrived in 1903 with Edward Redfield and visited Monhegan. And although other artists had been there earlier, his influence on the importance of Monhegan as a muse for artists was really elevated. He quickly told some of his students in New York, Rockwell Kent and George Bellows among them, saying, "You must come to Maine." Bellows did some work on Monhegan, but he also worked in Camden. He came to Maine a few times during the mid-19-teens, and here capturing a construction of a wooden boat, the type of vessel that was part of the United States war effort in World War I. And of course, probably the best known group of artists whose work is associated with Maine is those of the Wyeths. N.C. Wyeth came to Maine in 1920, bought a home, and from that moment on, his family summered there and continues to today. It is where Andrew Wyeth developed a remarkable body of work, of which you'll see more shortly. And his son, Jamie, who continues to work in Maine regularly today, established one of the great artistic legacies in the history of American art. And no story about the Wyeths would be complete without talking about the Olsen House, one of the museum's 2 historic sites, along with the Farnsworth homestead, which is on the National Register. The Olsen House is a National Historic Landmark, currently undergoing a major study in preparation of a historic structure report to determine how to preserve this house for the long term, which is quite a challenge and a story for another time. But the Olsen House, interestingly, has been not just associated with Andrew Wyeth's work there, some 300 works created over a 30-year period from the late 1930s until the death of the Olsens in 1967 and 68. But the Olsen House has served as a muse for photographers. George Tice was there, Paul Caponegro, and many others. And Andy Wyeth's work is deeply associated with his time spent at the Olsens, with Alvaro and Christina, the siblings who lived there for their entire lives. And his watercolor of the wood stove is one of his best known images from that period. And I see Orrington was mentioned earlier by Barbara, and this is Waldo Pierce's humorous depiction of a fire at East Orrington in 1940. Pierce grew up in Bangor, Maine. His father was one of the great so-called lumber barons who forested the great North Woods and made a fortune at it. Waldo went to Harvard. He was not the most avid of students. I think he barely got through, and then traveled abroad. He became great friends with many literary figures of his day, and we have a large body of his work. He's a real Maine character, and although not well known in the history of American art, his work so delightfully captures the character of Maine. Photographers, as I suggested, have also flocked to Maine, beginning in the late 19th century, and especially in the middle of the 20th century. Berenice Abbott was one of them, but Rudy Burkhardt, who worked in New York, also spent time here in photographing. And much more recently, Joyce Tennyson, a gifted photographer who's published many books of her work, is one of the more recent photographers who established a strong reputation here in Maine. I mentioned Rudy Burkhardt, whose photograph I just showed you. Well, here he's perched atop the roof of a house rented by Red Grooms and his wife, Mimi Gross, in 1964. And it depicts a group of artists who discovered Maine in the late 1940s, often through attending the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. What they discovered was a great school, inspiring work, a great group of students and teachers, and a very nice place to live to escape from their very modest digs in New York City in the 1940s and 1950s. And here, Mimi Gross is here, Yvonne Jaquette, who was then Rudy Burkhardt's wife, Alex Katz. It was quite a crowd, and Red Grooms depicted this crowd of artists at a key moment in the development of their art in the early 1960s. And the artist probably best known, even more so than Andrew Wyeth, who's associated with Maine, is Louise Nevelson. Although most people do not recognize, or do not know rather, that she grew up in Maine. Her father came here shortly before 1900 with his two brothers to escape the pogroms and repression against Jewish people in what was then part of the Russian Empire. He figured he could make it here, and his family soon followed about 5 years later. And Louise Nevelson grew up here in Maine. She attended high school here. She was the captain of the women's basketball team. And this was the place where she found herself, discovering that art was the thing that she wanted to do with her life. She soon left for New York after high school graduation. She married. And spent the next 2 decades into the 1950s struggling to make ends meet as an artist. She showed a lot of work, did not sell very much, and was continually supported by her 2 siblings back here in Rockland until she hit it big in the late 1950s. We have the second largest collection of Louise Nevelson's work in the world, and are very happy to tell the story about how she came here and how she created a life for herself as one of the most important sculptors of the 20th century. Another figure whose work is prominent in the museum because of his Maine connections is Robert Indiana. Of course, he was one of the members of the so-called pop art movement, but he came to Maine in the late 1960s to the island of Vinyl Haven, discovered an old Oddfellows lodge there that his companion on that first trip bought and rented to him to use as a studio in the late summer months, which he did for the next 6 or 7 years, and then finally bought the Star of Hope, an old Oddfellows lodge. And he remained there for 40 years until his death in 2018. And we're fortunate to have 2 significant bodies of work by Indiana, the Hartley Elegy series, seen in the right, and of course, one of his iconic love sculptures. Another important artist family that was here for quite a long time in the 20th century and remains here today is the Porter family. They had a summer home on Great Spruce Head Island, which is today an artist residency program and still used by the family. And the 2 brothers, Elliot Porter, the great photographer, and Fairfield Porter, the painter, often use Maine as the subject matter, although Porter, of course, traveled the world as a photographer, capturing some of the most remarkable landscapes across the world, including in this example of Glen Canyon Dam, before the river was dammed. What Lucy Farnsworth did that was distinctive in her will was to create essentially 3 entities. The first thing she wanted to do was to preserve her home and open it to the public, which it did in 1938, actually 10 years before the museum itself was open. The other thing she wanted to do, of course, was to create an art museum in memory of her father, and not in her name, but her father's name. And the third thing that she wanted to do was to create a public library, understanding, I think, that in order for the museum to be successful and its curators to do their work, they were going to need a specialized art library. And the art library at the Farnsworth is one of the oldest, I think it's the only publicly accessible art library dedicated to art in the state of Maine. And what we have done is collect works that represent the book arts from the 18th century up to the present. Certainly the most prominent of the artists who's worked in books is Rockwell Kent. And you see his iconic Moby Dick here in a luxury version of a large format 3-volume set that included his wood engravings. And it's encased in a so-called slipcase made of aluminum. It's one of the most well-known of Rockwell Kent's books containing his illustrations, and affectionately known as the whale in the pail because of its aluminum slipcase. Another aspect of our collecting in the area of the book arts, however, are decorative book covers, of which there are a great many, and which is a growing area of collecting across the United States. And these are just 2 examples representing the kinds of things we have, and which are part of our exhibition program as well. So the library was the 3rd creation, and we continue to exhibit and collect contemporary art with a focus on artists who've lived and worked in Maine. That is the museum's mission, to celebrate Maine's role in American art. David Driscoll is an American artist of African descent who came here when Skowhegan School opened in 1946, and he continued to make work here, having a home here in the DC area as well as here in Maine. He recently passed away, sadly dying of COVID-19. Celeste Roberge is a Maine native and one of many artists who have found a new home in Maine and new inspiration for making their art here. All of this started from Lucy Farnsworth, who grew up in this street in the heart of Rockland, close to its central business district, in which her father owned many buildings, and close to the harbor, which was really an economic part of the economic growth of Rockland, like so many mid-coast and down east ports in the state of Maine. She did something that was remarkable. She was one of the very few women who in the early 20th century created art museums, the most famous of which, of course, is Isabella Stewart Gardner, who with her husband and possessing great wealth collected in an extraordinarily different kind of way than the Farnsworth Art Museum has ever been able to. And Lucy was not a collector, but she was dedicated to doing something for the community in which she grew up, in which she spent most of her life. And that was certainly a great surprise to the people of Rockland. What I've long felt about the Farnsworth Art Museum is that it would be a gem in a city of 500,000 anywhere in the United States. And there it sits in Rockland, a city of about 8,000 people, entirely due to her own vision. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was absolutely fascinating. And I want to also thank many of our guests this evening for the wonderful comments you're entering into the chat room. So thank you. And thank you again, Michael, and congratulations. And for the second honor book award, the committee named Frederick Law Olmsted, Plans and Views of Communities and Private Estates as the 2021 honor book. The volume was edited by Charles E. Beveridge, leading U.S. authority on Olmsted, Lauren Meier, landscape preservationist and co-editor of the Master List of Design Projects of the Olmsted Firm, 1857 through 1979, and Irene Mills, landscape designer. The 12th and final volume in the series, The Papers of Frederick Law Olmsted, this lavishly illustrated book with more than 500 images, is the first comprehensive presentation of Olmsted's design concepts for communities and private estates. I want you to hear directly from a member of the book prize committee who wrote this about the volume. Everything about this book is outstanding. Organization, research, writing, photographs, maps, plans, reproduction quality, printing quality, etc. This is an amazing achievement that makes available in detail the philosophy, design process, and output of Frederick Law Olmsted. It is my pleasure to recognize Frederick Law Olmsted, Plans and Views of Communities and Private Estates as a 2021 honor book. Charles Beveridge will discuss this superb publication with us. Thank you, Charles.
Well, thank you. I was delighted when I learned that we had received this recognition for our work on this book, because I have an interest in New England. I'm a New Englander, and the presentations this evening have reminded me that even more. Some of my family were soldiers along the Kennebec in the French and Indian Wars. And at the end of the war, they moved up to Penobscot Bay, where it had become safe as a result of that war. And I grew up in Camden. My father had moved to Camden because I think he wanted to be in sight of North Haven, the island where his family had moved before the Revolution. In any case, I've also benefited greatly from Historic New England and its resources and its staff, and that added even more to my pleasure in this award. Excuse me. Now, this volume is national in its subject, deals with Olmsted's career throughout the nation for the whole of his working career. However, I do believe and fondly think that it makes a substantial contribution to the story of Olmsted's contribution of landscape to New England. Actually, fully half of the material, half of the projects dealt with in the book are those in New England. That means that's some 35 significant designs, 35 places in New England that will now, we hope, be well explained and illustrated. That's a whole range, not only of private estates, but of residential communities, of academic campuses, material relating to his collaboration with the architect Henry Hobson Richardson, and also government buildings and public libraries and other institutions of that sort, working with Richard Richardson. So that New England emphasis is, I think, significant and I hope valuable. And indeed, I'm very pleased that Historic New England has judged that volume makes a significant contribution to the subject. As the image here, which is a dust jacket of the volume, does show that indeed it is national in emphasis. It covers the whole range of work that Olmsted did during his career, all the way across the country, all kinds of the whole range of designs other than public parks. That is to say, particularly designing space for living, and carries out and illustrates and describes the concept he had of getting Americans to live outdoors and providing opportunities for that in his designs and in his example, opportunities in their own private spaces and also in residential communities, and his concept of creating the more openly built city, as he called it, in metropolitan America. And it covers also his regional planning in the New York City area, meaning creating the more openly built city in the whole Bronx area and Staten Island. Also, the plans he did in Chicago, in the area of Chicago, Riverside, Illinois, and others. And also the plans he made for expanding the street system of the District of Columbia. So all of those indeed have national significance and very important, nationally important examples of his ideas. And we hope that we, in both of these, in this volume, have illustrated and explained his work. And indeed, that has been the purpose of the prose that we provided. It provided us a chance to focus on and explain his work and to illustrate it. It was not in a way that was not possible before. We have drawn from historic photographs, especially from historic New England. And we have, with the new technology of color scanning, have been able to create images, readable images and demonstrations of his planning with examples of his plans throughout the volume. And both of those are contributions that have become possible only fairly recently. And in fact, we have relied greatly on the staff of the Olmsted National Historic Site in Brookline, Mass. For all of this. And all great thanks to them too. The other part that this volume represents also, I want to emphasize, it does mark the end of the work of preparing the edition of the papers of Frederick Law Olmsted. 12 volumes, many years in preparation. And the final part has been 2 volumes that are a large format that allowed us to focus on the individual projects, not only on simply the range of his writings, but to focus piece by piece on individual projects of his. And one of the 2 volumes that we end the series with. This is that we are celebrating one of the months. Is the one that has to do with his public parks. So we dedicated a full volume to that. That came out a few years ago, but I think it is the fullest presentation of his work as a park designer, for which he is greatly noted. And we had that opportunity to make a reference work that can really show his intent. And in fact, it's not only a description of his whole career and illustration, it's an explanation and demonstration of the Olmstedian style of design. And the hope is that with this volume and the one we are celebrating tonight, we make it possible to see what is Olmstedian, what is special about Olmsted's design. That in the setting also, not only of the completion of the 12 volumes of the Olmsted papers, but also the bicentennial of his birth, which is coming next year in 2022. The other, at least, you have seen indeed, that is the other, this is the second round that you have been able to see on the screen. Those 2 volumes are the final stage of our work, and has permitted us to deal with and to present visually Olmsted's career and ideas more fully than we could in the early stages. And I greatly appreciate the recognition from Historic New England for this work. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charles, for just an astonishing accomplishment, and thank you for sharing it with us. And now for the Historic New England Book Prize Award. The Historic New England Book Prize Committee selected Boston's Apollo, Thomas McKellar and John Singer Sargent, edited by Nathaniel Silver, Leah and William Pourview, curator of the collection at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, as the winner of the 2021 Historic New England Book Prize. This extraordinary volume, published in conjunction with a 2020 exhibition of the same title at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, explores the collaboration between renowned painter John Singer Sargent and little-known African-American model Thomas McKellar, who worked with Sargent between 1916 and 1925. Through 8 essays by Nathaniel and 7 other contributors, the book examines Sargent's drawings of McKellar in detail, offers the first biography of McKellar, and presents a window into African-American life in early 20th century Boston. A member of the book prize committee wrote, "This book is a model of original research, lucid prose, and artful presentation. It begins and ends with the objects. Along the way, it takes the reader into uncharted waters inviting us to consider the drawings from many different perspectives: the artist, model, patron, collector, curator, and a contemporary artist. It confronts complicated issues of race and sexuality with candor and eloquence. I actually put it down feeling exhilarated. It is now my pleasure to introduce Nathaniel Silver to you. Nathaniel.
Thank you so much, Finn, for that wonderful introduction and that amazing honor. And thank you to all of Historic New England and the committee for this amazing honor. I'm really touched. I was touched in particular by the reviewers' remarks. This was very much a collaborative project and one to which we hope to bring multiple perspectives. So I'm thrilled that that came through. Before I speak a little bit about the work, I just wanted to say that this, as an edited volume, I really wanted to thank all of my authors, Colm Toybeen, Lorraine O'Grady, Erica Hirschler, Trevor Fairbrother, Nikki Green, Paul Fisher, and Casey Riley. It really was a collaborative project, and I could not have done it without them. Now I'm going to share some images on my screen. Apologies for the delay. Here we are with the book cover. The exhibition that this publication accompanied was in 2020, and as you'll see from the dates, it tracked unfortunately the outbreak of COVID-19 forcing the global shutdown, including in Boston, where our exhibition closed after about 6 weeks. We were able to reopen it, luckily, and extend the run thanks to our colleagues at the Museum of Fine Arts, and it ultimately ran through October. For those of you who didn't see it, I would encourage you to explore the online resources of the museum. There is, in fact, a virtual tour on our website, as well as several short films that recorded some of the programs that we ran during the course of that exhibition. The exhibition was very much one focused on the objects, just as the publication was. And at the core of the exhibition was a group of objects, a group of works on paper by the artist John Singer Sargent, and you see them here on the screen. I came across these works for the first time, for me, 4 years ago, in our storage facility. They had lain there for some time, and I wasn't familiar with this particular group of works by John Singer Sargent at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, even though we have this very rich collection of Sargent's works, because Sargent was, of course, great friends with Isabella Stewart Gardner. So it was something of a surprise to see these works, which had never been displayed as a group before. And as I looked at them closely, two things immediately jumped out. One was that most of them were studies for figures in the murals at the Museum of Fine Arts on the ceiling of the new entrance of the Museum of Fine Arts that John Singer Sargent painted over the course of 2 campaigns at the end of the second decade of the 20th century. And the other thing was that the model in most of them was a young African-American man. And that was something of a surprise, because the more research I did on Sargent, the more it became clear that most of his models were white. So this model certainly stood out for the very least for reasons of his skin color. And beyond that, the fact that all of the figures in the final murals, all of the figures in the ceiling of the Museum of Fine Arts were, of course, white. So there was clearly a story to be told here. The story of the Museum of Fine Arts murals had been told many times and very well, but there was a new way to tell it. And that was through the perspective of the model, of this young man. Research had been done on him, and he had been identified already. His name was Thomas McKellar. And we decided that this exhibition would tell the story of this rich collaboration between John Singer Sargent and Thomas McKellar as much as possible through the perspective of the model, and really trying to use multiple different points of view in order to kind of garner that perspective. In order to do that, we had to construct a biography of Thomas McKellar because, of course, for John Singer Sargent, it's very easy. There are many biographies of him, and it's very easy to find historical information on him. Whereas Thomas McKellar was not a celebrity painter. He was very little known in the art world, and it was much more difficult to reconstruct his life piece by piece. And over time, we came to put those pieces together. He was born in 1890 in Wilmington, North Carolina. And we don't know exactly when he left Wilmington, but it seems to have been, he seems to have been in Boston by about around 1912, 1913 at least. Why he left Wilmington remains a bit of a mystery. There is certainly one, before I talk about Wilmington in particular, I just wanted to mention quickly, in the exhibition itself and during the course of this research, we came across several other projects that he was involved in. So not just the MFA ceiling, but the murals at Harvard University's Widener Library, for which McKellar also modeled, the portrait of President Abbott Lawrence Lowell, then Harvard's president, and McKellar modeled the body for this portrait, and then a large bronze statue for the city of Plymouth, commemorating the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrim's Landing, and McKellar modeled the figure of Massasoit for Cyrus Dowling. So the scope of his career as a model, at the very least, was wide and broad. It went beyond Sargent alone, included a contemporary sculptor at the time. It was very clear that there was quite a big story to be told here. So as I mentioned, coming back to McKellar's life, he was born in Wilmington, and we didn't know exactly what made him want to leave, but it was clear that there was one event in the history of Wilmington which was absolutely cataclysmic, and that event was the Wilmington Massacre in 1898. So he would have been 8 years old. At the time, in that year, a group of white supremacists, infuriated by Black political and economic success, stormed through the city and began by burning down one of the Black-owned newspapers at that time. It led to a much larger attack on the Black population of the city. Many Black citizens were killed. Those who weren't fled. And it's very possible that even if Thomas McKellar didn't flee at this time, it would have been very clear that he did not have a bright future in Wilmington, as at that point, none of the Black residents did. And so it's very likely that this factored into his decision to come to Boston. At the time, Boston had jobs for many young Black men and women who were moving from the South to the North as part of the Great Migration and looking for work. One of the kinds of records that we used to find traces of Thomas McKellar were the publicly available records, like the Boston Census, and they gave us an idea of the basics of his life, his age, his height, and where he lived in the city. At this time, he was living in a boarding house. Who else lived in the boarding house at this time, and the different kinds of jobs that people had who were living with him. He seems to have come to Boston and found a job fairly quickly as a elevator operator and an attendant at the Hotel Vendome. The Hotel Vendome was at the time the premier luxury hotel in Boston. And this is where he met John Singer Sargent by chance in the elevator of the Hotel Vendome for the first time in 1916. In 1916, Sargent had come back to the city of Boston to finish up the unfinished commission of the Boston Public Library murals. And it was at that time that he was offered a new commission. And so he was staying at the Hotel Vendome. Here it is, it's no longer there. There's only a plaque that remains because it burned down many years ago. But you see a photograph here at the top of the screen. Now, in addition to public records, there were other types of sources. We had to be creative about trying to recreate what Thomas McKellar might have experienced at the time, since we didn't have the kinds of copious correspondence, for example, that we did with John Singer Sargent. And one of the incredible and incredibly generous people who contributed to this project was the legendary conceptual artist, Lorraine O'Grady. Lorraine is around 86 years old, and her parents were a little bit younger than Thomas McKellar when they too moved to Boston, in that case, not from the South, but from Jamaica, to make a new life in the United States. And the challenges that they faced as Black residents in Boston at the time, Lorraine pointed out, were very much the kinds of challenges that Thomas McKellar might well have faced at that time. And so she was able to bring to it the perspective of her parents to kind of help us flesh out the experience of Thomas McKellar. She gave the example of her father, for example, who worked on the Boston and Albany Railroad, moving up as a waiter, then a steward, and finally as a bartender. The Pullman Porters Union was, of course, a large employer of young Black men at that time, and there was a major hub in Boston. And so that, in fact, there were even people in Thomas's boarding house who also worked on these trains. So it gave, even though it wasn't the voice of Thomas McKellar himself, it helped to paint a picture of that moment and to provide some context. We were incredibly lucky when we actually found some letters in his own hand. We really didn't hold out hope of being able to contribute his first person perspective because we just didn't know if any would survive. But thanks to Richard Ormond, descendant of John Singer Sargent and the leading scholar on Sargent's art, he had been able to track down a number of letters written by David McKibben. David McKibben, who had been the curator at the Boston Athenaeum and also a Sargent scholar, to Thomas McKellar and McKellar's replies to McKibben. So this is one from 1948. McKibben was interested in writing more about John Singer Sargent and his art. And at that time, he was tracking down individuals who knew John Singer Sargent to get a better picture of the artist. And one of the people he tracked down was Thomas McKellar. And this is one of the letters that McKellar sent him back. He says, you know, I received your letter and thanks McKibben for it. And McKellar, in his own words, describes himself as Sargent's main model in the United States. And that really confirmed some of the things that had begun to emerge at the beginning of the project. Again, that McKellar wasn't just modeling for one commission for Sargent, but actually for multiple commissions. And in fact, he worked for more than one artist as well. So these were really an invaluable source to bring McKellar's own perspective and his own voice to this project. The principal collaboration of these two men, and the first one, as far as we know, was the Museum of Fine Arts ceiling. You see here the entryway, the Fenway entrance to the Museum of Fine Arts, as it was before Sargent was commissioned on the left. In October of 1917, Sargent the MFA accepted Sargent's proposal to recreate this space. And so part of that recreation was architectural. Sargent insisted on certain architectural improvements that would make it possible for him to decorate the ceiling with paintings. And then, of course, the paintings and sculptures themselves. And that's what you see in the aftermath here on the right, once it was completed. McKellar modeled for not all of the figures on the ceiling. The figures, these are mostly figures of classical gods and goddesses and allegories of the arts, but most of them, as far as we can tell. Now, many people have asked us about the modeling process. The best evidence we have of the modeling process are, of course, the drawings themselves. And the drawings that we have in the Gardner Museum are wonderful because they're signed by John Singer Sargent. And they were clearly chosen specifically for Isabella Stewart Gardner, given to her before her death by Sargent. But there are many more drawings that also attest to this frequent collaboration between the two men, and they survive in museums across the United States. This is one letter that describes a little bit of the kind of interaction that there was between the two men on a regular basis, a daily basis. This is a letter from John Singer Sargent to Thomas McKellar, just saying that he said he was free and hoping to arrange a sitting. This sitting is in William James's studio. So this is William James, the painter, nephew of the writer Henry James. And John Singer Sargent seems to be borrowing his studio here, right on the Riverway. Now, this is the only letter that we found that actually attested to these sittings, but these kinds of arrangements must have been made more frequently verbally rather than in writing. And so it's not so surprising that this is one of the only written records that survives. And as I said, the drawings attest to many, many more of these sittings. In 1921, the first part of the rotunda opened with many of these reliefs that you see on the ceiling, as well as the larger scale paintings on canvas inserted in roundels in the ceiling. You see there at the bottom of the screen, Apollo surrounded by the Muses, for example. You see an allegory of art and architecture further around. And this was a major project which really glorified the MFA's new building with a cycle of images worthy of the sort of function of the building. It opened to great acclaim in October of 1921. Isabella Stewart Gardner certainly was keeping an eye on the process as it was moving along. She and Sargent spent much time together, and he even gave her parts of the model that he built to mock up the mural. And this is one of those pieces. This is a cast of one of the urns, the large scale, full-size urns that you see at the bottom of the photograph here. That's today in the Gardner Museum's collection. The Museum of Fine Arts trustees were so thrilled with this project, they asked Sargent to extend it over the top of the staircase. And that's also attested by McKellar's own writings as well. He mentions to McKibben that Sargent's next big task was the decoration of the staircase. And he even names one of the figures and describes exactly his role in it. He says, "Atlas with the world on his shoulders. This was my body, except my head." Sargent studied McKellar's body in many different poses and from many different positions. And it is the body that you see for many of the figures in the cycle. But of course, the head is never his, and the skin color is never his either. And so these were the kinds of pieces of evidence that helped us to piece together which figures McKellar actually modeled for. So I mentioned at the beginning, Thomas McKellar wasn't only the model for the MFA murals, but also for another project. Harvard University managed to commission Sargent to do a separate cycle of murals while he was in Boston for the MFA murals. These were to decorate Widener Library, and you see the two mural panels on either side of the main staircase. They were murals commemorating the Harvard dead from World War I. McKellar and at least one other man modeled for these murals. So you see one of the studies in preparation for the return home of the American soldiers, which is the mural on the right-hand side. And you see one of the studies for it here, which is now in the Harvard Art Museums. The figure on the left seems to be McKellar. He also was a veteran. He himself had been drafted in World War II. He was trained. He served on bases in the United States, but was never sent abroad, and was spared combat ultimately by the armistice. He was in fact asked by Sargent to bring uniforms from his base to help model these figures. And so, yes, as I mentioned, you see him here on the right-hand side. Now, as been mentioned, this exhibition raised questions of race and class and sexuality that we felt were as relevant to the present as they were to Sargent and McKellar's time. And the question of sexuality was really one that came up over and over again, in part because of work that, pioneering work that Trevor Fairbrother had done on John Singer Sargent, as a gay painter, and had really discussed his sexuality openly for the first time, and for the fact that Thomas McKellar, he had made this incredibly beautiful and carefully worked portrait. And this is a portrait that led us to open the question in a way of whether Thomas McKellar and John Singer Sargent had some kind of relationship. And that's a question that we'll never have an answer for, but it was one that we were able to pose to audiences. And it was one that I think this, this painting often raises. Now, just to give a little bit of context, the painting was a study originally for one of the roundels in the ceiling of the Museum of Fine Arts, and you can see it, the round shape inscribed on the canvas in the background. And yet at some point, Sargent changed his mind and transformed it into a portrait. And it's Sargent's only monumental male nude portrait. So it stands out certainly in that way. Today, as I mentioned, a part of the Museum of Fine Arts collection. And one of the interesting things about it was that it remained in Sargent's studio. It was never sold, but in fact, Sargent kept it. So it seems to have meant something special to him. And it was seen by another model, who I quoted here on the screen, Anton Camp, who knew McKellar as another model who Sargent had worked with. And it just attested to the fact that this painting was in the studio and seemed to commemorate, at the very least, the working relationship between the two men, and possibly more than that as well. Now, Isabella Stewart Gardner certainly played a role in this relationship, because while Sargent was in Boston, the two of them spent extensive time together. And we know that, well, she must have met Thomas McKellar on many occasions, but we know of at least one occasion that's documented. And that was when Sargent was working in the Pope building, as he regularly did. That was his principal studio. He was working with McKellar, and Gardner came to visit them. Now, Gardner in 1919 had a stroke, and so she was somewhat incapacitated. And at that time, and when she came for this visit, Thomas McKellar actually carried her up the stairs. She had brought a gramophone with her. She and Sargent shared a love of flamenco records, so it was very likely that they hoped to listen to some flamenco records together. But it was just a reminder that the two of them would have met, not just on this occasion, but on many other occasions. So she was not just given a gift of drawings that were, most of which were of Thomas McKellar, but of a man that she herself knew and had gotten to know over time. And these were all perspectives, that the historical perspectives and contextual perspectives that we brought to the exhibition and to the catalog. And the one final perspective was the perspective of Thomas McKellar's family. Thanks to the incredible research of my research assistant, Alejandro Nodarcy, we were able to track down Deirdre McKellar O'Brien, who's in the foreground of this picture, in the middle of the picture. And she knew nothing of the relationship between Sargent and Thomas McKellar. Thomas McKellar had been her great uncle. And she was absolutely delighted and completely blown away to learn that he had been Sargent's principal model in the United States. She came to Boston to visit us. We looked at the drawings together. We went to the Museum of Fine Arts together to look at the portrait. She was so proud to see a portrait of her ancestor on the wall in the Museum of Fine Arts. And we also visited where Thomas McKellar was buried in Mattapan. So we made a short film. Our visiting curator performing arts, Helga Davis, made a short film about this process, really incorporating and focusing on Deirdre's perspective. And that's something that I encourage you to watch on our website if you want to learn a little bit more. It was really very moving to find out more about Deirdre's family perspective. I just want to finish here with a view of the exhibition which ultimately was somewhat short-lived in person, but again, which very much lives on through the catalog, through the scholarship of the wonderful contributors who agreed to write for this catalog, and through all of the many perspectives that we brought to this project. So thank you again, Vin, and thank you to Historic New England and to the committee for this incredible honor.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel. Absolutely extraordinary. Thank you. We have come to the end of our program. This evening has flown by. We could have just had more of it because those presentations were so rich and fascinating. And thank you again to all of our awardees and presenters. The evening was filled with amazing stories of collecting, research, and writing, not to mention brilliant images. Once again, I want to acknowledge the outstanding contributions of our collectors and authors, and to thank the committees and my colleagues, Lorna and Claire. It has been a pleasure to spend time with you this evening. I look forward to seeing you at next year's Night of Prizes, hopefully in person. So thanks to all, and happy Thanksgiving. Good night.